So, assumptions. Assumptions are conscious or unconscious beliefs that something is true or will happen. Based on our previous experiences or simply on beliefs, we assume that certain interventions or strategies work in a certain context. The assumptions are factors that influence the causal links between activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. If an assumption is not true, it is likely that a certain activity will not lead to a particular output. When poorly substantiated assumptions and faulty hypotheses that we call killer assumptions in the logical framework terminology are identified, then the plan or theory of change should be changed. For instance, by adding new activities to cater for the killer assumptions, or unrealistic results shall be modified or deleted. The objective of the exercise is to discover program designers' taken for granted assumptions, critically examine them in the planning process, and monitor them subsequently. It is important to identify assumptions that cannot be taken for granted also. Program planners often need to be kindly disturbed, you could say, in order to become aware of these hidden assumptions. Remember that only the critical assumptions are to be included. That means assumptions which can be a big risk to the development intervention if they are found not to be true. So how do we do? Well, assumptions can be identified by asking the following questions. Are we sure that implementing our activities will lead to the desired outputs? Are we sure that if our outputs are produced, that they will lead to the expected outcomes? And if our outputs lead to the achievement of the medium-term outcomes, can we then be sure that the long-term impact will materialize? In practice, the assumptions explain or question the logic between the different ambitions of our project. So here are some questions that can help you when you want to identify assumptions. You might want to download the PowerPoint presentation or take a screenshot of these questions so you can use them for the next assignment. Let's try it out. So it's time for an exercise on assumptions. So please use the same project or program that you used for the stakeholder analysis, the problem analysis, and the theory of change work previously. Now identify critical assumptions underlying the theory of change and evaluate whether you think they will hold good. Suggest actions or modifications of the project setup that will make it more probable that the assumptions will hold good. And finally, write down the main assumptions, the main points of your analysis in a text document or on paper to be used later in connection with subsequent analysis. You can perhaps use the example of the training of journalists to remind yourself how assumptions come in between the different elements of your theory of change or intervention logic. I hope that you have found it useful to work with and identify the assumptions underlying the intervention logic of your program. Before we finish the submodule on assumptions, there are 4 key points that we want you to remember. First, assumptions are things that we take for granted. Testing assumptions is important if we want our development interventions to succeed, and sometimes we're not sufficiently aware of underlying assumptions. Assumptions can be identified by asking the basic if-then questions, like, if we undertake these activities, are we then sure that this and this will happen? If we are not sure, we will have to work with the assumption. Thirdly, when we identify critical assumptions that might jeopardize our project, we have to find out what we can do in order to make the assumptions hold good. Otherwise, we have a very unsolid project.